Welcome to the Climate Diplomacy Podcast, a podcast from the Berlin-based Think and Do tank Adelphi, bringing you the latest insights and debates in international climate diplomacy and security. We are your hosts, Raquel Monayer.
And I'm Alexandra Steinkraus. In this series, you will hear from experts and practitioners offering their take on climate foreign policy, climate-related impacts to security, and promoting peace and resilience in the changing climate. For more information, please visit climate-diplomacy.org or follow @ClimateDiplo on Twitter.
Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to this special edition celebrating the 50th episode of the Climate Diplomacy Podcast. We're delighted to be here today, to have gotten so far, and this is because of you, of course. So stick around, and we have an announcement also at the end of the episode, so don't miss that. And to celebrate the 50th episode, we are taking you in a journey around the world, looking back continent by continent at the countries and regions we've discussed in the podcast so far. But before we start our journey, let us look at how it all started. So the Climate Diplomacy Podcast started back in 2019 as an initiative from Martin Wall, who was a Marie Curie Caroline Fellow and was at the time seconded to Adelphi, so working in our climate diplomacy and security team. By the way, shout out to Martin, who is today head of public diplomacy and press at the Irish Embassy in Berlin. So yeah, Martin, let us know if you heard this. So Martin started this off in 2019, and the first 4 episodes of the podcast are actually hosted by him. But then he had to leave to his next post, and we wanted to keep up with this great initiative. And it took a while, but after about a year, we picked it up, and we haven't stopped since.
I love opening the episode this month with a little reminiscing. It's always fun at different events at the Irish Embassy to say hi to Martin and also get his input on the latest episode that we've put out. And actually, the podcast was one of my entry points into Adelphi. And even before I joined as a member of the team and one of the former hosts after Martin, along with you, Raquel, Hanna Kurno was a classmate of mine at Hertie, where we did our masters. And I started listening when she started sending me episodes and different things to listen to. So we have a very nice history here at the Climate Diplomacy Podcast. And our old school listeners may already know this, but most of our guests are members of the Climate Security Expert Network, of which this network comprises of approximately 30 international experts based around the globe. And it's a hub for research on the linkages between climate and security, the effects of climate change on security, and responses to these issues. And the CSEN initially was set up to support the group of friends on climate and security and the climate security mechanism of the United Nations system by synthesizing scientific knowledge and expertise, advising on different things like entry points for building resilience on climate security risks, and also helping to strengthen a shared understanding of challenges and opportunities. And of course, we use our CSEN quite a bit, still guests on the podcast, but also to help meet different regional needs when people have questions about different dynamics or who want to interview different regional experts, as well as on different reports, policy briefs. You'll also frequently find their names as authors.
True, and we're going to add a link to the webpage of the Climate Security Expert Network because we will be mentioning the names of several members that were guests here at the podcast, and this way you can look them up. Let's get started. We promised a continent by continent journey. Let's get started with Asia, right? The first episode that was focusing on an Asian country was episode number 7, which was looking at Kazakhstan and how China's support to energy, transportation, and industrial projects in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative influence emission trajectories in the country. So a little bit different from what we're used to in the climate security field, because we had a colleague from climate policy, which I will mention quickly. It's Daria Ivleva, our own, and now head of program of climate policy here at Adelphi. So she brought in this topic that to me was definitely absolutely new, and also of a country we don't hear much about. Super interesting. And she spoke about the complex dynamics of decarbonization and geopolitics that is playing out in the country and the region as well. And on the climate security side, Kazakhstan is also a part of our joint project that is together with the OSCE. Now, this is already not on the podcast episode anymore, just to mention that we are working with Kazakhstan together with other Central Asian countries on with the OSCE in the project that is called Strengthening Responses to Security Risks from Climate Change. It's quite a large one. It's been running since 2020. And Central Asia is one of the regions we work with. And we have advanced a lot of our work in the region already, particularly Central Asia. The next phase of the project is already implementation. So definitely something to look forward to. And if this interests you, let us know, get in touch.
And now over to Afghanistan. Back in 2021, we had podcast episode number 8 featuring Ollie Brown on Afghanistan that outlines how climate shocks can worsen poverty, weaken governance, and contribute to instability, as well as how frequent droughts can fuel the drug economy, how scarcer water and arable land can increase community level conflict, as well as how resource politics around green energy minerals can even become more strained. So while some of these dynamics have developed and others haven't so much, for example, large-scale mining in Afghanistan isn't quite as developed as it could have been by now. China has still expressed interest in investing over 10 billion into mineral mining as of April of 2023. And recently, I'm glad that you already spoke a bit broader than the podcast episode, Raquel, because that also gives me a bit of leniency too. But a recent Total Policy brief by one of our CSUN experts, actually, I believe our newest CSUN expert, Asim Meyer, outlined the challenges that Afghanistan is facing in terms of the escalating economic losses due to climate change, which I think in his calculation is up to USD 3 billion annually. And this, of course, is in spite of contributing minimally to global emissions and the problem itself. So the policy brief outlines some of the challenges that Afghanistan is facing in accessing climate finance, like limited governance, limited fiscal space, and also international non-recognition. And these challenges have created a situation where there's a large reliance on humanitarian aid, which is also in increasing decline over this year, so creating even more tension. And some of interesting viable solutions that he presents is things like decentralized climate finance to get past political bottlenecks. For example, this could mean funds go through accredited intermediaries like UN agencies, the World Bank, international NGOs, or also accrediting capable national NGOs to manage smaller grants. And one thing here, speaking about climate finance, after going through some of these episodes, it's certainly present in many of our discussions. That speaks to a lot of wider trends in terms of we've more and more been mentioning climate finance, especially since COP28 in Dubai, and the need for more accessible and just more climate financing going to fragile countries.
Oh, interesting. How about Bangladesh and South Asia?
Yes, so now we're continuing to stay in Asia, but quite the geographic hop now. So coming to South Asia. So all the way back in episode 11 of the podcast, Janasari Jayaram joined to outline key fragilities and how climate change not only undermines human security, but can also heighten conflict risks. And some of these risks that she outlined included escalation of regional tensions due to competition over resources, worsening economic and livelihood insecurity, increased migratory movements, as well as rapid urbanization linked to slow and rapid onset disasters. So this meaning as rapid urbanization takes place, this has strained existing resources and damaged ecosystem services in urban areas and can undermine cities' abilities to cope with disasters. And these effects can ultimately undermine social stability as well as governmental legitimacy.
And maybe you can tell us what an ecosystem service is.
Oh, yes. Thanks, Raquel. I guess already getting a little bit jargony early on into the episode, but an ecosystem service is just references one of the many benefits that ecosystems or wildlife provide to humans. So they include essential resources like food and water, regulating processes like climate and water purification, but also, very importantly, cultural benefits like recreation as well as spiritual enrichment. So that is what an ecosystem service is. And before we move on to our next continent, we also very recently, just 2 episodes ago, we took a deeper dive into Bangladesh's borderlands, like you mentioned, with Tasnia, who's another new CSIN member. As we said earlier, we have a lot of them as guests on the episodes, so you'll certainly recognize some faces if you look at all the CSIN members. And she echoed a lot of these dynamics that were present from earlier on, episode 11 on South Asia. And she really stressed the importance of community-based participatory research and involving communities impacted as equal partners and active participants in the research process, all the way from shaping the research to analyzing the data and identifying different solutions. And these core principles of collaboration, inclusiveness, are also very present in a lot of work within like the Weathering Risk Initiative, but also different aspects of our work. So I'm sure if we had like podcast bingo, the number of times we've mentioned community-based participatory research or different methods, it would be bingo blackout.
Not more than climate risks security. I just got a question to you. How would our listeners recognize people's faces by looking at the season list?
Oh, no.
Podcast?
You know, sometimes when people speak, you can just picture their face.
For sure.
No, but
Yeah.
that's a very good question. So in this case, they wouldn't be recognize anyone, but you can finally put a face to the sound of their voice if you look at the CSUN webpage.
Or if they actually follow us also on social media, they would see the cards for each episode that do have the picture, actually, now that I think of it.
Okay,
There we
that's
go.
true. You've inadvertently answered your own questions.
Speaking of, well, not speaking of anything, but yeah, let's move now to Africa, probably the region that we mostly work on. I don't know if that's accurate, but if not the one, then definitely one of the ones. We have 3 countries and 2 sub-regions. Let's get started with Mali.
So, as you mentioned, Africa is one of the regions that is both most represented in the global discourse. So, we inevitably have quite a lot of resources to pull from in order to talk about the continent. And it's probably the region, or in this case, a full continent, with the most amount of analysis. But this also means that there's a large amount of good practices and lessons to learn from. And a lot of those principles, one thing I have to mention is, of course, the Africa Climate Security Risk Assessment, which we've never actually done a full podcast on the multiple 100-page report, but references and different case studies have certainly popped up multiple times throughout the last few years.
Something to look forward to. I'm pretty sure there will be an episode on
Yes.
assessment.
Yes, eventually, I think we'll definitely have an episode on the Africa Climate Security Risk Assessment or the Common African Position and this process that's happening with the lead up to COP. So, one way or another, stay tuned for an upcoming episode. And 2 of the recommendations that are explicit within it that I think pop up quite a bit throughout different podcasts, but also some of the different resources that we have on these 3 countries are 1, African challenges need African solutions, and 2, the importance of intersectionality when it comes to addressing these vulnerabilities. So, as you mentioned, our first stop is indeed Mali, all the way back in episode 9 of the podcast. We had Chitra as a guest all the way in May 2021, talking about the impacts of climate change on insecurity as well as gender inequality. And she was also the main author of the first full climate security assessment that was part of the Weathering Risk Initiative. So quite monumental. And that was, of course, on Mali. And this was actually the first report that was published after I started at Adelphi. But one of the things that really helped me understand how climate change can weaken government structures and further establish armed groups was this report. So in Mali, one of the examples given was how armed groups have established themselves as providers of conflict resolution mechanisms and also providers of access to justice for disputes over natural resources in the absence of effective governance by formal authorities. And another good example is how natural resources and how climate impacts can contribute to competition over natural resources, not only between different livelihood groups, like between farmers and herders over access to pastures and water resources, but also between fishers over fishing rights, between farmers over land ownership and boundaries, and between pastoralists over access and management of pastures and water points. And also, even in between different livelihood groups, it's not just farmers and herders conflicts. It's also between communities over forest resources, between communities over impacts of mining, and even between fishers and pastoralists, and or farmers over water use and cattle entering water bodies. So this was, at least for me, a very foundational assessment that helped really make a lot of these climate risk pathways and different frameworks very concrete in my understanding of the complexity of these different pathways.
Yeah, interesting.
Mhm.
So let's jump a little bit from Mali to Southern Africa. So we had a guest in episode 15, Otilia Monganitze of the Institute for Security Studies. And that was actually a very special episode because we brought in 3 guests to speak about examples of locally informed solutions. So it wasn't only about Southern Africa, but also the Horn of Africa and the Arctic. So it's an interesting one to see also the complete differences between these cases. And I guess we'll get into these other regions later on in this episode. But it was also special because it was a live recording. It had video and an actual audience that was interacting with us the whole time in the chat. It was a wild ride. Actually, it's time for another one of those, by the way. What do you think, Alex?
I think BCSC 2025.
Yeah, it was in the context of BCSC, true. Exactly. That, yeah, maybe. Let's see. Anyway, back to Southern Africa. So Otilia, she spoke about the very wide climatic variety in the region, actually. There are 16 countries that includes islands, deserts, forest countries, also a very populous region, lots of inequalities. So there are very different dynamics that are playing out throughout the region, but also a few that are common across the whole region, like how slow and sudden onset climate disasters trigger forced migration. I mean, we remember the horrific floods that happened in Mozambique a couple of years ago, and also all the dynamics of armed groups that are happening in the country's north. Also, how climate-induced disasters can lead to or compound social unrest and instability, I guess referring to my point on the armed groups right now. And also sea level rise and marine ecosystem disruption, right? I mean, not all countries in Southern Africa are coastal communities, but you have these coastal countries and also island states. And these impacts have a lot of effect on economic growth and also on spurring migration and all these dynamics that we know of fragility and climate-related security risks that come from it, livelihood insecurity and so forth. And the CSAN Southern Africa Risk Brief that Otilia actually wrote does list a number of interesting entry points to address these risks. Quite a few, actually. I was looking at it today when I was researching for this episode. And many, I'm not going to read them all. I mean, you can access it if you're interested. But many of them are relating to the Southern African Development Community, the SADC. So it's definitely worth checking out, especially if you're looking for concrete entry points or like stakeholders to engage with.
That's a good point. A lot of the insights, both from podcasts, but also some of the different ones that we're referencing today, come from these climate risk briefs. And luckily, those are also centralized on the CSUN page that not only has the experts, but there's also a section that has all the different knowledge products that have been produced as part of it. So even more reason to click on the link. So now if we go over to the Horn of Africa, we've covered it a few times. So we had Sagal Abshir sharing these insights during the live from BCSC 2021 episode that also had Otilia. And later on, we had Ayan Mahamoud from IGAD, as well as another CSIM member who joined and talked about success stories and outlined some key climate-related risks to peace and security within the Horn of Africa. And then Somalia was also a topic of conversation in episode 20 with Christoph Hader. And I think this region, including Somalia, provides a really good example of dedicating climate security capacities within institutions, as well as different missions and initiatives. And different organizations in Africa have started to create these dedicated climate security positions and capacities. For example, the United Nations Assistance Mission in Somalia, UNSAM, has a dedicated climate security and environmental advisor, which is Chris's role within the mission and what he joined the episode to talk about. And this was the first of its kind to work on incorporating elements of climate sensitivity and climate security into operational structures. And now the United Nations mission in South Sudan also has its own dedicated climate security advisor. And then even beyond missions and the national level, on a regional level, the Office of the Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa has a climate security advisor who works in close cooperation with other UN agencies and regional organizations like IGAD and the African Union to coordinate and implement sustainable natural resource management and also climate resilience initiatives throughout the region. So I think one big takeaway from the overview of these multiple different episodes that we've had is some of the success stories when it comes to institutionalization of climate change and climate security, as well as coordination between some of these bodies and what's possible, but also necessary to really scale things up and not only lead to action, but also coordinate so that way different actions are not overlapping and people can learn from things that did work, but as well as learn from things that didn't work and preemptively plan that.
Yeah, those are good ones with a lot of focus on processes, right? I really like them. And now to Libya. We actually had 2 episodes focusing on Libya, but they are quite different. The first one was episode 18 with Matthew Brubacher, who also wrote the CSAN risk brief on Libya. And I have to say, this is one of my favorite episodes of the podcast. Still is until today because, well, I didn't know much about Libya. I think that's the reason. And I guess this is the case for a lot of people, which led Matthew to really walk us through some of the country's political dynamics before getting into the climate security risks. Also, especially because we recorded, I think, just a couple of days or even the day after there was an assassination attempt on the Libyan prime minister. And that was an absolute accident, of course. It was already scheduled much earlier. It ended up that the political dynamics were more important that day. And he told us a bit about how there's a weak social contract in the country, also a very large administration that leaves a little space for development spending and also, of course, hindering the country's energy transition. And we also discussed at the time Europe's responsibility as a major consumer of Libyan oil, which is something that since then, I mean, that was, I think, 2021, and it has definitely gained in relevance since then, or maybe that's an understatement, but super interesting episode. I learned a lot. And then most recently, we welcomed Malak Al-Taib. So for episode 46, which was also super interesting, she brought up a whole other layer of the country's geopolitical dynamics. The talk focused on the weaponization of water and the impacts of political legacy and fragmentation on infrastructure and government. So very insightful as well, because not only is Malak from Libya, but she also has an engineering background on top of her international relations background. So she's, of course, very knowledgeable on the topic, and it was very interesting to listen to. And then we move right around the corner from North Africa to the Middle East. And the first Middle East episode we had was episode 22, looking at Syria, specifically the impacts of war on environment. And that was a different one because we had Lujain Haj Youssef, who is a Syrian journalist doing investigative journalism for independent news outlets in Syria. So, I mean, we generally have our typical climate security experts. So it was interesting to have someone with a different background to bring us insights that maybe we wouldn't think about. So Lujain spoke about an investigation that she's conducted into the specific environmental impacts caused by several parties involved in the Syrian war and what the concrete consequences are for the local population today and also in the future. And when I say specific, I do mean it. She really gets into which group is causing what type of damage in which part of the country. So do check it out. It's very interesting. And also in general, because he's a journalist, if you're interested in Syria and if you're interested in this rapidly changing political landscape of today, I would recommend following her work.
So that takes us over to Yemen. And then, similar to Libya, we have had two different episodes with a bit of time in between them on Yemen. So, one back at the end of 2023 with Hind al Irani on how the civil war in Yemen has impacted the lives of women, children, LGBTQ plus communities, and religious minorities. And one of the things that stuck out to me in this episode is she is also a journalist, so she's coming at it from another perspective, but also the emphasis on how women's rights have hindered climate adaptation in many cases throughout Yemen. So
that was very interesting. She had a lot of insights again into things that we wouldn't have thought about. True.
Exactly. And then earlier this year, we had Hisham Alomezi on an episode along with our colleague Sinead to talk about how conflict, climate change, and the environment intersect in Yemen. So a bit more of a broad conversation, but specifically on how climate and the environment can also be entry points for peace. So a little bit of flipping the narrative on Yemen. And of course, in Yemen, climate change, overexploitation, and 10 years of civil war has led to the degradation of natural resources. And its impact on social cohesion and conflict are widespread at the local level, but are poorly reflected in conflict analysis, programming, and also high-level peace efforts. So one of the recommendations that was part of our conversation and comes up in a lot of our conversations is the need to remove barriers to accessing climate finance and also the need to support climate and environmentally resilient livelihoods. Two of these things are we've had dedicated episodes to them, as well as is one of the threads that really tie things together. And then sticking within the Middle East, but zooming out to talk a bit more broadly regionally, talking about reframing things and as opportunities. We also had an episode at the end of last year with Ali Nasrallah, and we talked about renewable energy opportunities within the Middle East and green energy policy. And one of the things that really stands out to me about this conversation and the episode is how climate change, rising temperatures, and water scarcity are disrupting daily life and infrastructure. And I was thinking a lot about this conversation when we were writing one of our most recent opinion pieces on the platform, which Raquel, I think you'll also really like the title of. It's Climate Resilience, the Missing Piece in Post-Conflict Reconstruction, with peace spelled like P-E-A-C-E. I can't speak the italicized piece.
You know, I'm a sucker for catchy titles.
Exactly. So I had to share that with you. And in order to build lasting peace, post-conflict reconstruction needs to embed climate resilience at its core. And what this means is investing in infrastructure that can withstand future climate shocks, restoring degraded environments, and fostering community engagement to rebuild social cohesion. And one of the examples that popped up in the conversation with Ali, but also in the op-ed, was looking at the environmental impacts in Gaza, where, for example, the World Bank estimates that the environmental costs of conflict amount to as much as 411 million US dollars as of only March of this year. And this includes things like groundwater contamination, hazardous waste pollution, and the destruction of the coastal zone. But this number doesn't include other important aspects like human health or agriculture. Not only is there a big cost to rebuilding, and there's also more considerations that are needed that traditional reconstruction efforts don't take into account. There's also a big energy cost that goes into infrastructure rebuilding that often isn't, wasn't at the forefront of my mind until this conversation with Ali. So it's brought up a lot of interesting aspects that also echoed in future work and this most recent op-ed.
Yeah, thank you so much. Now we go really far, actually. We take like a big jump and we go to the Americas and the Caribbean, and we're going to go through two countries and two regions here. So, interesting one, too, getting started with the Arctic.
So, a little bit farther away from the other episodes that we're going to cover in this region is the Arctic. And if I'm really thinking about it before listening to this episode, when Hannah probably sent it to me when it came out, I probably wouldn't have been able to make the really strong connection between climate change and security risks in the Arctic, even though it is, in theory, closer to home for me to the US as some of our other regions. But one of the things that came up in this episode is how Indigenous communities in the Arctic are at the front lines of climate change. And this is even the case in Alaska, where communities face existential threats from a variety of climate impacts, like coastal erosion and shrinking ice means that coastal communities are increasingly threatened by storm surges, and permafrost thaws threaten existing infrastructure and also complicates future development of infrastructure where critical infrastructure is already lacking. And there's also questions of migration and relocation that come up. And then, of course, one of the things that's even more often talked about is the geopolitical side of that. And in all likelihood, given different global developments, this harder national security will come up more and more as it becomes a higher priority for a lot of different governments. So, one example from this in the Arctic is that Russia is expanding and modernizing its military capabilities and conducts significant amounts of advanced weapons tests in the Arctic. So, this remilitarization of previously abandoned Cold War bases and development of greater operational capabilities are a concern to Russia's neighbors, especially now with the Russian war of aggression in Ukraine after the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and different growing aggression towards both the international community and citizens at home. So, climate change also provides an avenue for China to strengthen its Arctic presence, and the country has expanded efforts to gain access, presence, and influence through a lot of soft power diplomatic efforts, as well as financial investment and scientific and military purposes. So now we're jumping a little
Yeah.
bit more warmer.
Yeah, I was gonna ask. That's grim. Maybe there's something better going on in the Caribbean.
Yes, our conversation with Christian Zakur was one of my favorites to record, and it was so nice. We recorded it twice, not because
Because it was so nice. Tell us
not
about
because it
it.
was so nice, because it didn't record half of the conversation when we used a different recording studio. But it was indeed very nice to have this conversation two times with Christian. And one of the things that really stood out, because she talked about a lot of different local initiatives, like the Caribbean Tree Planting Project, and things that were being scaled up to make an even bigger impact. But also, one of the things that echoes a lot of like needs across different other regions is there's a lot of potential for more interregional knowledge sharing. For example, a lot of our conversation, of course, centered around the Caribbean and different climate security risks, but also some solutions. But we also talked a bit broader about small island developing states. And there's some of these different interregional organizations that have a lot of potential to increase knowledge exchange. So I think that is a good sign of hope after a bit of a talk of the Arctic is some really successful initiatives that they've had, but also a lot of potential, especially for small island developing states that are increasingly very quickly affected by coastal and sea level rise to have more exchange amongst each other and learn.
That's great. And Christiane is great. She's also quite active in youth spaces, right?
Yes.
Very good. And now zoom in within the Caribbean region into Haiti, a bit of an outstanding case there.
Yes. So, of course, Haiti was during the episode and is still very much facing a deep security, political, and humanitarian crisis, and is simultaneously one of the most vulnerable countries within Latin America and the Caribbean to climate change. And rising temperatures, declining rainfall have intensified. Drought and climate related storms are growing more intense, which has caused devastated flooding within the country. And by adversely impacting livelihoods, food security, water scarcity, and health conditions, climate change is also exacerbating the current multifaceted and complex crisis that the country is grappling with. So, this episode really dove into the study Roots for Peace and the experiences of the researchers behind the report in setting up the Haiti Climate Security Working Group. So, this report outlines the different pathways that climate change is impacting security within Haiti. But one of the really interesting things in this conversation was also just the process of setting up the report. So one of the things that was really interesting in this episode was talking to the different researchers as well as UNEP colleague on how the Haiti Climate Security Working Group was set up. And this was established in 2022 at the initiative of the United Nations as well as Haiti's Ministry of the Environment. And it brings together UN agencies, international organizations, Haitian government institutions, as well as civil society organizations. And to help guide the work of this group, Adelphi led this collaborative effort to undertake a study mapping out these linkages between climate peace and security in Haiti and proposing initial steps on how to resolve them. So that was really exciting to talk about not only some of the entry points and the different dynamics that were found in the study, but talk through how something like this was set up and also set up in a way that it can continue to drive action in these matters. Of course, in very challenging circumstances in Haiti at the moment, but hopefully there will continue to be these efforts continued. And some of the priority areas of action that were outlined is the importance of building a high-level vision through multi-sectoral dialogue and the need to really embed protection and restoration of the environment at the center of all different economic, political, and social decisions, the need to decentralize responses and empower local communities to not only be part of, say, in this example, like the research study and different interviews and reaching people to get a sense of their needs, their concerns, and the different realities that they face, but also make sure that they're not passive recipients of charity, but are really embedded in a clear mechanism for accountability within all these initiatives and are a part of the action. And of course, I have to talk about climate finance once more, but the need for increasing and targeted funding in order to address these challenges. So that includes not only an increase in more accessibility, but coordination between and within donors to avoid this duplication of efforts and make sure that funds are dispersed as smartly as possible.
No, that study was really, I have a lot of appreciation for everyone who was involved in it because doing a study that consults with local civil society in that context of compound crises, that was such a process. I have a lot of respect.
Exactly. That's a very good point, is this study was one of the scenarios where there wasn't the possibility for colleagues at Adelphi to actually travel to Haiti and conduct interviews or different focus groups. So not only was this climate security working group necessary in terms to commission the study and say that it's needed and part in the implementing efforts, but really important in also making sure that voices from local communities were consulted when putting the study together. In the case when those local researchers were the only people available to do most of these in-person things and couldn't rely completely on online interviews and making sure that different people could be reached.
Yeah, that is, I mean, the inclusion of local communities' voices is always, it's good practice anyway, but that was just more difficult than normal. Yeah, one more country here in the Americas and Caribbean region, Colombia. I mean, how could we not talk about Colombia, right? No country in the region has engaged as much with the climate and security agenda as Colombia. And of course, this is because of Colombia's history with having The longest conflict in the Western Hemisphere, ongoing since 1964. And it's also a conflict that has a lot of overlap with the environment and the use and distribution of lands and natural resources. I guess that's why Colombia is so present and really present in a knowledgeable way and in the way of bringing in lessons for the climate, peace, and security agenda. But of course, all this experience it's bad, but also has led Colombia to advance its own experience around conflict resolution. And there are a lot of lessons to be learned through their experience. So in episode 38, we welcomed two regional experts. So we had Valeria Patricia Moscoso Urtula. She's from Justice Rapid Response, and Hector Morales Munoz, which is our own senior advisor here in our team, also from Colombia. And they came in to speak about the importance of considering environmental factors in pursuing victim-centered and community-based approaches to transitional and restorative justice, and also about lessons from the Colombian case for the international humanitarian justice system, because it has informed it quite a lot through its experience. And in this episode, we also learned about Cosmovision. Remember, Alex? Which is, well, should I tell them what it is? No, you better go listen to the episode. Because, yeah, I'm not just being cheeky. I'm actually afraid that I'll take it out of its very complex context and make it sound like something else. But to listen to it, it's interesting. Hector from our team, he also has a lot of experience on the field with environmental peace building in the context of Colombia's conflict and with the lens of the resource and how it plays into the conflict. So a lot of insights coming from him, from his experience, and from Valeria, of course, of talking to communities, for descendant communities, and affected, and how they are affected by the conflict, how they're affected by the climate change and environmental change, and both. So it's very complex and interesting. And Colombia itself is a very interesting case. Another jump, last jump, Alex. And let's jump to Europe, because newsflash, there's also climate environment related insecurity in Europe. Tell us about it, Alex.
That's true. So we did visit the EU in episode 14 of the podcast. This episode largely focused on climate diplomacy and the policy landscape and how it's rapidly evolved with developments in legislation like the European Green Deal. And this was EU climate diplomacy in a post-COVID world. So hitting the COVID-19 angle. But
technically, we're still in a post-COVID world, right?
And we will technically forever be. But I think here I'm also going to go a bit off podcast, because very good episode, go listen to it. But there have been even more recent developments very specific to climate peace and security that if we had a 3-hour-long podcast, maybe we could go to every aspect of the EU internal policies, inner workings, but we will skip that for today's purposes, especially since we were going to listen to that. No. And also not me in the post-podcast editing, so I will keep it short and sweet. So following the adoption of the EU's joint communication on the climate and security nexus, which calls for the Commission and the European External Action Service to start conducting comprehensive trend analyses, the first and the inaugural climate security trend analysis was published earlier in February, and it was called Navigating Peace, playing on the compass theme. And this report sets out 5 pathways and 12 key trends through which climate change exacerbates security risks. And these pathways will continue to help shape the complex interplay between environmental degradation, climate change, and security in the years ahead, and help necessitate effective action from the European Union. And the report provides actionable insights for policymakers as well as practitioners. And one thing here, I think especially of note, is that the EU is uniquely positioned as a global leader in addressing climate insecurity. So especially in today's current, more fragmented landscape, rapidly changing priorities, hopefully a document like this and the leadership that the European Union has showed will continue and help fill a vacuum in some spaces where different countries, different leadership aren't taking part the same way. And One other development within the European Union that is tied to the trends analysis is earlier this year, there was the launch of their climate security dialogues. And there was one in Brussels, which marked the second iteration. But this, even more importantly, launched a series of regional climate security dialogues across the world, both this year, but also continuing into the next. And these dialogues are meant to provide a forum for exchange on EU strategic priorities and strengthen the link between institutional processes and effective EU engagement at both the regional and national level around the world. So far, one has taken place in Nairobi in either February or March of this year. But these are some really positive developments taking place, and hopefully we'll continue to see more action moving forward.
And that's it. That was
That's it.
the around the world trip. Fantastic. Let me try to wrap up what we just did in a couple of minutes for those who just scrolled to the end and who enjoyed the summaries. Let's see if I can get this right. I mean, I'm sure I'm going to leave a lot of things out, but
Yeah, I feel like this one, especially since some of the input is also different key takeaways or summaries from other episodes, you're tasked with a summary within a partial summary. So best of luck.
it's more of an overview. Let's see. Yeah, we kicked off the episode looking at Asia. So we looked back at the Belt and Road Initiative in Kazakhstan, and then also looked at droughts and the drug economy in Afghanistan, and ecosystem services and borderland communities in Bangladesh. Then we moved to Africa, where we remember the impacts of climate change on insecurity and gender inequality in Mali. We looked at a complex landscape of risks in southern Africa with all the different climate zones and everything. The success stories that came from the Horn of Africa. Also, Somalia's experience as the first country with the dedicated UN climate security advisor, and the unique political dynamics in Libya. Then we moved to the Middle East, where we recalled how the war impacted the environment and people in Syria in very specific ways, insights and opportunities for green energy development in the broader Middle Eastern region. And then we moved to the Americas and the Caribbean, where we reflected on some of the hard security matters that are afflicting the Arctic region, also local initiatives and knowledge sharing in the Caribbean. Of course, Haiti's compound insecurity, political and humanitarian crises, and their intersection with climate risks, of course, and Colombia's experiences with transitional and restorative justice, and the EU and all the different processes that are going on there. You just heard it.
Is it time for the announcement, Raquel?
Oh, the announcement. Almost forgot.
Yeah.
No, I'm kidding. I didn't forget.
I feel like you did tease it as a little bit more exciting than what it will be.
Oh, true. Yeah. It's not the most fantastic. Well, everything has a silver lining, right? Let's go. Well, I'm unfortunately leaving Adelphi soon. Oh my God. So I will no longer be a host of this podcast. And this one stings. I have to say, I've been doing this since 2020. I've loved every single thing about it. I've also loved to meet so many of you in the events and conferences of the world. And have you come up to us to say how much you love the podcast? You're amazing. We love that. Continue doing that, by the way. You'll stay in the competent hands of Alexandra, so there will be a familiar voice in your earphones, so you will be very well taken care of here. And as per myself, I am closing up 8 fantastic years at Adelphi and moving to, well, slightly new waters, still in the climate, peace, and security field, but with a focus on more methodological side of things around mediating and facilitating dialogues for peace. So feel free to add me on LinkedIn and let's stay in touch. And thank you so much for the amazing time. That's also to you, Alex.
Thank you so much for everything, Raquel. And from my side, it was great jumping in as a co-host of the podcast and having you as guidance, especially for the first few episodes, and really having all the know-how. And I look forward to eventually having you on as a guest in the future to share insights from your future work within the CPS space. But yes, alas, the podcast will continue. We'll continue to have monthly episodes with myself, but also potentially guest co-hosts from our climate diplomacy and security team at Adelphi. So there will continue to be a familiar voice, but also a few new ones jumping into the picture. And how nice was it to wrap up your time with the podcast in episode number 50. That certainly feels monumental.
I timed it perfectly. That video was an accident. But yeah, love that. And I will be listening. So pressure's on.
So then, on that note, this was the Climate Diplomacy Podcast. We will be back with another episode in a few weeks. You can follow us for all the latest updates on X, Blue Sky, and LinkedIn. Thank you for tuning in, and until next month, goodbye.
Goodbye.